At 17, a boy aged out of the system was given a deed to a forgotten piece of land with a rusted metal hut built into a cave. What he discovered inside didn't just give him a home, it gave him a reason to fight. If you've ever felt lost or like the world had forgotten you, hit that subscribe button and stick around. This story is for you. The door of the Northgate group home clicked shut behind me with a sound I knew better than my own name. It was a clean, metallic sound, the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. For 2 years, that sound had meant I was in for the night. Safe, if you could call it that. Trapped, if you were being honest. Today, it meant I was out. For good. My 18th birthday was 3 weeks away, but the state had run out of patience, and so had Mrs. Gable. She stood on the other side of the glass-paneled door, her arms crossed, her expression a careful mixture of professional pity and personal relief. I was no longer her problem. I held a single cardboard box in my arms, a pathetic archive of my 17 years. A few worn paperbacks, a change of clothes, a faded photo of a woman I barely remembered, and an official-looking manila envelope that felt heavier than everything else combined. That envelope was the reason I was standing on a cracked sidewalk in the weak November sunlight, instead of being shipped to a transitional housing shelter downtown. It was my inheritance, or, as the social worker had called it, my familial asset. I never thought I had any of those. My file said orphan, a word that always felt both too dramatic and too simple for the truth. The truth was, I was just alone. The wind cut through my thin jacket, and I shifted the box in my arms. The corner of the envelope poked into my ribs. Inside was a deed, a single key, and a letter from a lawyer I'd spoken to once on the phone. His voice had been dry as dust, explaining that my grandfather, a man I hadn't seen since I was 5, had passed away and left me his sole possession. 5 acres of undeveloped land in a county I'd never heard of. There are some complications, the lawyer, a Mr. Abernathy, had said. Significant tax arrears, a standing offer from a development corporation. Frankly, son, the offer is your best bet. It'll clear the debt and leave you with a little starting capital. He made it sound so simple. Take the money, start over. Forget the 5 acres of rocks and trees you never knew you had. Mrs. Gable had agreed. It's a blessing, Leo, she'd said, not looking up from her paperwork. A clean break. But the key in the envelope felt heavy in my hand when I'd shaken it out. It was old, iron, and pitted with rust. It didn't look like a key to a clean break. It looked like a key to something complicated and old, something that didn't want to be forgotten. So I'd said no. I'd told Mr. Abernathy I wanted to see it first. He'd sighed, a long, weary sound across the phone line. The state considers you provisionally emancipated for the purposes of this inheritance. The choice is yours. But I'm advising you, as your counsel, that this is a mistake. There's nothing out there for you, Leo. Maybe he was right. Standing there, with the group home finally and forever at my back, the weight of nothing felt immense. It was a cold, empty space pressing in on all sides. But it was also a blank page. For the first time, there was no one to tell me when to wake up, when to eat, when to sleep. No one to check my pockets or read my mail. The fear of that freedom was a physical thing, a knot in my stomach. But underneath it, a tiny, stubborn flicker of something else. Hope, maybe, or just curiosity. I looked down at the box, at the picture of my mom, smiling in a summer dress, her arm around a man with a kind, weathered face I vaguely recognized as my grandfather. They were standing in front of an old pickup truck, trees blurring in the background. It was the only picture I had of him. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. Mr. Abernathy was wrong. There was something out there. There were 5 acres of something, and for the first time in a long time, I had a direction to walk in. It wasn't a home, not yet. It was just a way. And right then, a way was enough. The meeting with the lawyer had been as sterile and gray as his voice on the phone. His office was on the 32nd floor of a glass tower that scraped the sky, a place that made me feel small and grubby just by walking into the lobby. Mr. Abernathy himself was a man made of straight lines and sharp angles, from his perfectly parted hair to the crease in his trousers. He didn't shake my hand. He gestured to a chair, and I sat, placing my box on the floor beside me. The manila envelope was on his desk, looking thin and unimportant against the stacks of other, fatter files. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. "Let's be clear. I was your grandfather's attorney for a single transaction 20 years ago. My inclusion in his will was a formality. My obligation is to inform you of your inheritance and its encumbrances. My advice is personal, not professional." He slid the envelope across the vast expanse of polished wood. "This is the deed to a parcel of land in Telluride County, 5.2 acres. It is, for all intents and purposes, worthless." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It's landlocked on 3 sides by federal forest and on the 4th by property owned by the Pioneer Development Corporation. It has no road access, no utilities. It is, legally speaking, a liability." A liability. The word hung in the air-conditioned quiet of the room. I thought of the meager contents of my box. Everything I owned was a liability. "My grandfather," I started, my voice sounding rough and unused. "Did he live there?" Abernathy gave a short, humorless laugh. "Live there? No. No one could live there. He purchased it as let's call it a passion project. He was a geologist, or he called himself one. Spent his time mapping rock formations and collecting water samples. He believed the land had some unique mineralogical significance. He was mistaken. He opened a drawer and pulled out another file, this one thicker. He opened it, and the logo on the letterhead was a stylized mountain range with the words Pioneer Development underneath. Pioneer has been trying to acquire that parcel for a decade. Your grandfather refused every offer. Now that he's gone, they've renewed their offer to his estate, which is you. They are offering $30,000. $30,000. The number was abstract, meaningless. It might as well have been $1 million. It was more money than I had ever imagined holding. "That sounds like a lot," I said quietly. "It's not," Abernathy countered, his tone sharp. "It's a nuisance fee. They want the land to complete their portfolio for a future resort project. But here's the complication." He tapped a different sheet of paper. "Your grandfather did not pay property taxes for the last 6 years. The total arrears, with penalties and interest, comes to $28,477. The county has a lien on the property. If the taxes aren't paid within 90 days, the land will be seized and sold at public auction." He let that sink in. The silence was heavy, punctuated by the distant, muffled siren of a world I wasn't part of. "So Pioneer's offer," I worked it out slowly. "It pays the taxes and leaves me with, what, $1,500? $1,623 to be exact," he said, without a hint of irony. "It's not a fortune, but it's a start, a deposit on an apartment, a bus ticket somewhere warmer. It's a way out, Leo." He saw me as a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied up, the delinquent grandson of his eccentric, dead client. He was offering me a clean slate, a handful of cash, and a final erasure of the man in the photograph. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused from my mandatory work-study job washing dishes at the group home. I thought about the key, the weight of it. "What's on the land?" I asked. "Right now, is there a building, a shed?" Abernathy frowned, annoyed by the question. He consulted his notes. "The survey from 5 years ago indicates a non-permanent structure, a Quonset hut, I believe, and a cave. The property is essentially a rock face with a bit of forest. The hut is listed as being in a state of disrepair." A hut and a cave. The image formed in my mind, strange and compelling. A metal shell leaning against a hole in the earth. "I want to go," I said, the words coming out firmer than I expected. "I want to see it." Abernathy's jaw tightened. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze analytical, dismissive. He was recalculating. He had assumed I was desperate, and I was, but he had mistaken desperation for a lack of will. "The bus ticket to the town of Silver Creek will cost you $74, he said, his voice clipped. "From there, it's an 8-mile walk. There is no address. You'll need a topographical map. I've enclosed one. Once you're there, I have no idea how you plan to survive. But the choice, as I said, is yours. The offer from Pioneer stands for 90 days. My advice is to come to your senses long before then." He stood up, a clear dismissal. The meeting was over. He had done his duty. I stood too, picking up my box. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy." He didn't reply. He just watched me walk out, a problem leaving his office, on its way to becoming someone else's. Or no one's at all. The bus groaned out of the city's concrete heart, leaving the tall buildings behind like a discarded skyline. I sat by a grimy window, my box on the seat beside me, and watched the world I knew dissolve into a smear of suburbs, then strip malls, then fields. For the first few hours, my mind was a frantic buzz of Abernathy's words. Liability, tax arrears, nuisance fee. Each phrase was a brick in a wall of impossibility. I had $63 left in my pocket after buying the bus ticket and a few provisions: peanut butter, a loaf of bread, a cheap sleeping bag. It was the entirety of my net worth. The absurdity of it all was a bitter taste in my mouth. I was a 17-year-old kid with a box of junk and a deed to a piece of worthless, indebted land, heading toward a place even the lawyer who managed it called a mistake. Every instinct screamed at me to get off at the next stop, find a phone, and call Abernathy. Take the $1,600. Run. But then I'd look at the topographical map spread across my lap. It was a beautiful thing, all swirling contour lines in delicate shades of brown and green. A blue line marked a creek. A dense green patch was labeled National Forest. And in the middle of it all, a small, hand-drawn red square. Parcel 734-B. My land. My grandfather had drawn that square. His handwriting was small and precise. He'd made other marks, too. Tiny, cryptic symbols next to certain elevations, a faint arrow pointing toward the northern edge of the property. It was a language I didn't understand, but it was a message nonetheless. It felt like a conversation across time. As the hours passed, the landscape began to change dramatically. The flat fields gave way to rolling hills, then to the jagged foothills of a mountain range I'd only ever seen in pictures. The trees grew taller, denser. The skies seemed bigger, a deeper, colder blue. We climbed, the bus engine whining in protest. We passed through small towns with single stoplights and peeling paint on their storefronts. People got on and off, their faces weathered, their clothes practical. They looked at me and my cardboard box with a kind of blank, non-judgmental curiosity. I was clearly not from around here. I was something other. The sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows that turned the mountains into sleeping giants, when the bus driver called out, "Silver Creek, last stop." I was the only one left. I grabbed my box and my sleeping bag and stepped out into the shock of cold, thin air. The town of Silver Creek was little more than a wide spot in the road. A general store with a gas pump out front, a sleepy-looking diner, a post office, and a handful of houses. A single stoplight blinked yellow in the gathering dusk, illuminating nothing. The bus pulled away with a sigh of air brakes, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving me in a profound and sudden silence. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the whisper of wind in the pines and the distant rush of water. It was the sound of a world that didn't care about sirens or deadlines or the clicking of deadbolts. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in. It smelled of pine needles and damp earth and snow. A man came out of the general store, locking the door behind him. He was old, with a face like a crumpled map and a kind smile. He nodded at me. "You look a little lost, son." "I'm looking for the old access road," I said, my voice feeling small in the vastness. "Up toward the ridge." He looked at my box, then at the darkening sky. "That's a long walk, and a cold night to be doing it. You got a place to stay?" "I have a place," I said, hoping it was true. He pursed his lips, not convinced, but not wanting to pry. "Road's about a mile that way," he pointed. "Turns to dirt after the bridge. Gets rough. Ain't seen anyone go up there in years, not since old man Astor passed." Astor. My grandfather. The name felt strange to hear spoken aloud. "Thank you," I said. "You be careful," he called after me as I started walking. "Weather's turning." He was right. The wind had teeth now. I pulled my jacket tighter and shifted the box, starting the long walk out of the last town and into the wilderness. The pavement ended as promised, and my sneakers crunched on gravel. The road narrowed, hemmed in by towering pines that blotted out the last of the light. I walked for what felt like hours, guided only by a weak flashlight beam dancing on the path ahead. The fear was back, cold and sharp. Every rustle in the woods was a threat. Every shadow was a monster. I was a city kid, a creature of concrete and artificial light. This was not my world. But I kept the map in my mind, the little red square. My grandfather had walked this road. He had known these woods. I wasn't just walking toward a piece of land. I was walking into his story. And maybe, just maybe, I was walking toward the beginning of my own. The dirt road finally petered out into a faint trail, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. I had walked through most of the night, resting only for an hour in my sleeping bag when the cold became too much to bear. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from the weight of the box, but according to the map, I was close. The trail opened into a small, overgrown clearing, and I saw it. It stopped me in my tracks. It was both more and less than I had imagined. A large, corrugated steel arch, a Quonset hut, was shoved up against a sheer granite cliff face. It wasn't just next to the rock, it was integrated with it. The back half of the hut disappeared into a wide, dark opening, the mouth of a cave. The steel was rusted a deep, angry orange, streaked with black from years of rain and snow. The front was a mess of plywood and salvaged windows, one of which was shattered, a jagged grin in the morning light. Weeds and small saplings grew right up to the walls, trying to reclaim the metal structure and pull it back into the earth. It looked less like a building and more like the wreckage of one, a scar on the landscape. This was it, parcel 734-B, my inheritance, my home. A wave of something close to despair washed over me. Abernathy was right. It was worthless. It was a ruin. I dropped the box in my sleeping bag and just stood there, listening to the drip of water from the eaves and the sigh of the wind. I was an idiot. A romantic, stupid kid who'd chosen a rusty key over $1,600. I almost turned around right then. I could be back in Silver Creek by noon, find a phone, and beg Abernathy to take the deal. But I was exhausted, and the key was in my pocket. I walked closer, my feet crunching on fallen leaves and broken glass. The door was a solid-looking slab of wood with a heavy-duty padlock. I pulled out the iron key. It felt ancient in my hand. With a groan of protest from my tired muscles, I slid it into the lock. It was stiff, but with a hard twist, something inside gave way with a loud, satisfying clunk. The lock fell open. I pulled the heavy door inward. It scraped against the floor, and a wave of air rolled out to meet me. It smelled of cold stone, damp earth, rust, and something else. Something like abandonment. The inside was one large, cavernous space. The curved metal walls amplified the silence. Light filtered in through the dirty windows and the hole in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes. The floor was part concrete slab, part packed earth where the hut transitioned into the cave. A cast-iron wood stove, rusted but solid, stood in one corner with a stack of firewood beside it. Against one wall was a crude wooden workbench, littered with old tools, jars of screws, and coils of wire. A simple cot with a rotted mattress was pushed against the other wall. And in the center of the room, solid and imposing, was a heavy, olive-drab metal footlocker. It was the kind of thing you saw in old army movies. It was sealed with its own formidable-looking lock. My eyes scanned the space. It was a survivalist's den, not a home. Everything was practical, chosen for function over comfort. It was the space of a man who wasn't planning on having company. I walked deeper inside, my footsteps echoing in the strange, half-building, half-cave. The air grew colder as I moved toward the back. The smooth, arched ceiling of the Quonset gave way to the rough, uneven stone of the cave roof. It went back further than I could see, a black void that swallowed the weak light. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. What was back there? I turned my attention back to the main room. I ran my hand over the workbench. The tools were old but well cared for. A heavy hammer, a set of wrenches laid out in order of size, a hand drill. This was the workspace of a man who built things, who fixed things, a man who knew how to make something out of nothing. On the wall above the bench, tacked next to a faded calendar from 15 years ago, was a single yellowed photograph. It was another copy of the picture from my box. My mom and my grandfather, standing by the truck. But this one was bigger, clearer. I could see the details of my grandfather's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the gentle set of his mouth. He was looking at my mom, and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated love. Something tightened in my chest. He had kept this picture. He had looked at it every day in this strange, lonely place. I looked from the photo to the footlocker in the middle of the room. It was locked tight, a secret waiting in plain sight. Whatever my grandfather's story was, I knew the next chapter was inside that box. Finding a way into the footlocker became my single-minded obsession. The lock was a thick brass circle with no visible keyhole, a combination lock of a type I'd never seen. It was military grade, designed to resist tampering, and it was doing its job perfectly. I spent the first day dragging the box around, shaking it, listening for any clue. It was heavy, and the contents shifted with a dull, muffled thud. Nothing rattled. Nothing gave me a hint. My initial wave of despair had been replaced by a dogged, weary determination. I had come this far. I wasn't leaving until I knew what was in that box. I tried the tools from the workbench. I tried to pry the hinges with a crowbar, but the metal was too thick. I tried to smash the lock with a heavy hammer, but the blows just echoed uselessly through the hut, leaving small, shiny dents in the brass. Exhaustion and hunger were starting to set in. I ate 2 of my peanut butter sandwiches, rationing them carefully. I found a bucket that collected rainwater from the leak in the roof, and after inspecting it for rust, I drank the cold, clean water. It was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I spent the first night huddled in my new sleeping bag on the rotted cot, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. The wind howled around the metal shell of the hut, making it moan like a living thing. I heard the skittering of small animals, and once, the distant cry of a coyote. It was terrifying, but it was also real. It was the opposite of the sterile, predictable silence of the group home. Here, the world was loud and alive, and I was a tiny, fragile part of it. The next morning, fueled by another sandwich and a growing sense of frustration, I went back to the workbench. I wasn't going to beat the lock. I had to outsmart it. I looked at the tools again, not as blunt instruments, but as tools of precision. My eyes landed on the hand drill. It was old, with a wooden handle, but the bit was sharp. An idea, desperate and probably stupid, began to form. I wasn't going to get through the lock, but maybe I could get through the box itself. I found the thinnest drill bit in a small wooden case. I tipped the footlocker on its side and examined the seam where the lid met the body. There was a tiny gap, barely a millimeter wide. It was a long shot. I braced the tip of the drill against the lid, just above the seam. I leaned into it with all my weight and started turning the handle. The metal screeched in protest. For a long time, nothing happened. My arm burned, and sweat dripped into my eyes. I was just scratching the paint, but I kept going, turning and pushing, my frustration fueling the motion. Then, something changed. The drill bit caught. It bit into the steel. With a final grinding shriek, it punched through. A tiny hole, no bigger than a pinprick, now marred the olive-drab surface. I was shaking with effort and triumph. I drilled another hole, and another, working my way along the seam. It took hours. By the time I was done, I had a perforated line running the entire length of the front of the box. I took the crowbar, wedged the tip into the first hole, and pulled. The metal groaned, bent, and with a sound like tearing fabric, the seam began to rip open along the line I had drilled. I worked my way down the lid, prying and pulling, until the entire front edge was a jagged mess of torn steel. It wasn't elegant, but it was open. I lifted the mangled lid. The smell of old paper, oilcloth, and cedar rolled out. The contents were packed with military precision. On top was a neatly folded stack of wool blankets, still smelling faintly of mothballs. Beneath them, a treasure trove of survival gear. Canned food, lots of it. Beans, stew, fruit. A small camp stove with fuel canisters. Boxes of waterproof matches. A first aid kit. A water filter. It was a stockpile, enough to last for months. My grandfather had known someone would be coming here. He had known they would need to survive. My hands were trembling as I lifted out the cans. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, were two objects. The first was a small, hand-cranked generator with a light bulb attached, a source of power, of light. The second was a thick, leather-bound journal, and on top of the journal was a single, sealed envelope. On the front, in that same neat, precise handwriting from the map, was one word: Leo. My name. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold steel of the footlocker. The cans of food, the blankets, the generator, they were a gift of survival. But this envelope, this was something else. This was the reason. With unsteady fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thick and creamy. The ink was a faded blue. My dear Leo, it began. If you are reading this, then it means I am gone, and you have found your way here. I am sorry. That is the first thing I must say. I am sorry for not being in your life. I am sorry for the silence. I hope in time you will understand that my absence was not a failure of love, but a desperate act of it. I had to stop and take a breath, my eyes blurring. When your mother died, I wanted to take you in, more than anything in this world. But I was embroiled in something dangerous, something that had already cost me my career and my reputation. To bring you into my life then would have been to put you in harm's way. The system, for all its faults, was safer than I was. It was the hardest choice of my life, and not a day has gone by that I have not regretted it and second-guessed it. This land, this place, it is not much, but it is all I have to give you. It is a refuge, and it is a weapon. You will find what you need to survive in this box. But the real inheritance is not in this hut. It is deeper. It is in the rock itself. You have 90 days before the county seizes the land. The wolves who want this place, pioneer development, will seem like your only option. They are not. They are the enemy. Do not sell. Do not trust them. Your task, should you choose to accept it, is to find what I have hidden. It is a truth worth protecting. Start with the floor, the north wall, where the steel meets the stone. Be strong, my boy. You come from a line of stubborn people. You have it in you. He signed it simply, your grandfather, Thomas Astor. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring and sharpening. A weapon. Deeper. The north wall. He hadn't abandoned me. He had hidden me. He had left me a place of refuge, a stockpile of supplies, and a mission. I looked around the dusty, cold hut. It no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a fortress, a starting point. I wasn't a lost kid anymore. I was the keeper of a secret, and I had work to do. The first few days after reading the letter were a blur of frantic activity. The words 90 days were a constant ticking clock in the back of my mind. My grandfather's letter had given me a purpose, but it hadn't made the reality of my situation any less harsh. The nights were the worst. The temperature dropped precipitously as soon as the sun fell behind the ridge, and the thin walls of the Quonset hut seemed to amplify the cold. I'd huddle in my sleeping bag, layered with the wool blankets from the footlocker, and listen to the wind scour the mountainside. The loneliness was a physical presence, a weight on my chest. I'd think about the city, about the noise and the lights, about the simple, anonymous comfort of being surrounded by people, even if you didn't know them. Here, the isolation was absolute. More than once, I found myself staring at the crumpled offer letter from Pioneer Development, which I had kept tucked in my pocket. $30,000. A clean break. The words felt like a siren song, a temptation whispered on the wind. I could take the money. I could leave this cold, lonely place behind. I could find an apartment, get a job, be normal. Was I really cut out for this? This wild, hermit-like existence, chasing a ghost's cryptic clues? I was a kid from a group home, not a survivalist or a detective. The doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at the resolve the letter had given me. One night, it all came to a head. A storm rolled in, a furious assault of wind and freezing rain that hammered against the metal roof like 1,000 angry fists. The leak I had noticed earlier became a steady, miserable drip right over the cot. I moved the cot, but another leak started. Soon, it felt like the entire roof was weeping. I was cold, damp, and utterly miserable. I pulled out the hand-crank generator and frantically turned the handle, producing a weak, flickering light. In that pathetic glow, the hut looked even more derelict, the shadows in the corners deeper and more menacing. I was exhausted. My hands were raw from trying to patch the shattered window with a piece of plywood. My stomach ached from a diet of cold beans and peanut butter. I sat on the damp floor, the offer letter in my hand, and I broke. The tears came hot and fast, silent sobs of frustration and fear, and a grief so profound it felt like it was hollowing me out. I cried for my mother, who I barely knew. I cried for the grandfather I'd never had. And most of all, I cried for myself, for the scared, stupid kid who had chosen this impossible path. I was going to fail. I was going to freeze or starve, and my grandfather's secret, whatever it was, would be buried with me. The Pioneer offer wasn't a temptation. It was a lifeline. It was the only sane choice. My fingers were numb as I unfolded the letter. There was a phone number at the bottom. I could walk back to Silver Creek. I could make the call. It would all be over. But as I stared at the number, my grandfather's words echoed in my head. They are the enemy. I looked from the letter in my hand to the leather-bound journal sitting on the workbench. I hadn't opened it yet. I had been too focused on survival, on the immediate physical tasks. But the journal was part of it. It was part of the inheritance. With a deep, shuddering breath, I put the Pioneer letter away. I picked up the journal. The leather was worn smooth. I opened it to the first page. The entry was dated almost 20 years ago. "It begins," my grandfather had written. "They think I'm just a crazy old rockhound. Let them. The truth is in the water. The water never lies." The water never lies. The phrase was strange, poetic. I flipped through the pages. They were filled with meticulous, hand-drawn maps of the area, chemical formulas, and dense paragraphs of observations. It was the work of a man possessed by an idea. I didn't understand most of it, but I could feel the intensity, the passion, on every page. This wasn't the journal of a madman. It was the journal of a scientist, a warrior. He had spent years on this. He had sacrificed his family, his reputation, for whatever was in these pages. He had trusted me to finish it. The storm raged outside, but something inside me had settled. The crisis had passed. The tears had washed away the doubt, leaving a hard, clear certainty in its place. Selling was not an option. Running was not an option. My grandfather had given me a choice, and I was making it. I would not be the one to break his trust. I would stay. I would fight. I would find the truth in the water. My choice solidified into a routine. The fear and despair didn't vanish, but they receded, replaced by the relentless demands of the work. My grandfather's letter had given me a starting point. The north wall, where the steel meets the stone. This was the back of the hut, the place where the curved metal structure was bolted directly into the rock face of the cave entrance. The concrete floor of the hut ended about 10 feet from the back wall, giving way to the packed, uneven dirt of the cave floor. It was this transition zone that drew my attention. It looked seamless, natural. But my grandfather's words had planted a seed of suspicion. Nothing in this place was accidental. I started by clearing the area. There were old tarps, empty sacks, and discarded pieces of wood. I moved everything, sweeping the packed earth clean with a makeshift broom I fashioned from a branch and some twine. I ran my hands over the ground, feeling for any inconsistency. It was hard, almost like stone. I tapped it with the back of a hammer, listening to the sound. Thud, thud, thud. It was a solid, uniform sound. For 2 days I found nothing. The frustration began to creep back in. Was I misinterpreting the clue? Was I looking in the wrong place? I reread the letter, then consulted the journal. One of the hand-drawn maps in the journal was a detailed schematic of the Quonset hut itself. He'd labeled the dimensions, the gauge of the steel, the depth of the concrete footings. And in the corner, a small, almost invisible notation next to the drawing of the north wall. It was a number. 1.2 meters. 1.2 meters. From what? I went back to the wall and started measuring. 1.2 meters from the western wall. Nothing. From the eastern wall. Nothing. Then I saw it. On the schematic, the arrow for the 1.2 meter measurement didn't start at the side wall. It started at the exact point where the concrete floor ended. I unspooled a rusty tape measure I'd found. I hooked it to the edge of the concrete and measured exactly 1.2 meters into the earthen floor along the back wall. I marked the spot with a scratch from a nail. I knelt down and tapped that spot with the hammer. The sound was different. Not a dull thud, but a hollow, resonant boom. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was here. I grabbed a spade from the tool collection. The blade scraped uselessly against the packed earth. It was as hard as concrete. I switched to the crowbar, driving the tip into the ground with the hammer, chipping away at the surface. It was slow, brutal work. The ground wasn't just packed earth. It was mixed with some kind of resin or cement, a man-made surface designed to look natural. After an hour of chipping and prying, I had created a small hole. I peered inside. It was dark, but I could see that there was a void beneath. I worked with a renewed, feverish energy, widening the hole, ignoring the blisters forming on my hands. Finally, I had cleared a section big enough to see what was below. It wasn't a hidden chamber. It was a floor, a wooden floor. Beneath the fake layer of hardened earth was a subfloor of thick wooden planks. They were dark, treated with creosote, and laid neatly together. I had found it. The real floor. Using the crowbar, I pried up the first plank. It came away with a groan of old nails. The air that rose from the space below was cold and smelled of dust and dry paper. I shone my flashlight into the opening. Underneath the planks was a shallow, crawl-space-like area, about 2 feet deep, and it was filled with more boxes. Not footlockers, but archival storage boxes, the kind used for important documents. They were neatly labeled with dates and codes in my grandfather's precise hand. I pulled one out. It was heavy. I set it on the floor and opened it. It was filled with files, and inside the files were documents, geological surveys, water table maps, and lab reports. Stacks and stacks of lab reports from dozens of different independent laboratories. I opened one. It was a chemical analysis of a water sample. I didn't understand all the terminology, but I didn't need to. The summary at the bottom was clear. Sample contains levels of hexavalent chromium, arsenic, and perchlorate significantly exceeding EPA safety standards. I pulled out another file, another lab report. Same results. Another, and another. They were all the same. The boxes were full of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds of water samples taken over a period of almost 20 years, all showing catastrophic levels of industrial pollutants. And tacked to the inside lid of the box was a map. It was a larger, more detailed version of the area. My grandfather had marked the locations where each sample was taken. They formed a clear pattern, a plume of contamination spreading outward from a single point. A point located squarely on the property owned by Pioneer Development. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the inheritance. It wasn't a treasure. It was evidence. My grandfather wasn't a crazy rockhound. He was a citizen scientist, a whistleblower. He had spent 2 decades proving that Pioneer Development, the company that wanted to build a luxury resort, the company that wanted my land so badly, was poisoning the groundwater for the entire region. The land wasn't a liability. It was the only independent access point to the contaminated aquifer that wasn't owned by Pioneer. It was his listening post, his base of operations, and he had left it all to me. The weight of it was immense, a physical pressure. This was so much bigger than a piece of land or some back taxes. This was about the water for Silver Creek, for the farms downstream, for the entire valley. I looked from the box of damning evidence to the cave, its dark mouth seeming to watch me. The weapon, my grandfather had called it. He hadn't just given me a shield, he had given me a sword. I spent the next 2 days in the hut, a hermit surrounded by the ghosts of my grandfather's obsession. I barely ate or slept. I laid out every document, every map, every journal on the floor, turning the Quonset hut into a sprawling command center of evidence. I read until my eyes burned, absorbing the story of his 20-year war. It was all there, in his neat, meticulous handwriting. He had been a geologist for a big mining company. He'd raised concerns about their waste disposal practices and had been fired, blacklisted. They'd ruined his career. That company was later bought out, its assets and liabilities absorbed by a new corporation, Pioneer Development. They had buried their toxic history, but my grandfather never forgot. He couldn't prove it then, so he dedicated his life to proving it now. He bought this worthless piece of land because his research told him it sat directly over the main artery of the aquifer they were poisoning. It was the one place he could monitor their crimes without trespassing. The journals were the key. They were the narrative that tied all the disparate lab results together. He documented everything. The dates and times of their trucks moving near the property line at night. The strange colors he sometimes saw in the creek after a heavy rain. The decline in the local wildlife populations. He cross-referenced his water sample data with public records of cancer rates and birth defects in the communities downstream. It was a staggering, damning indictment, compiled with the lonely, painstaking precision of a man who knew he was fighting a giant. He had tried to go to the authorities years ago. The journal detailed his meetings with the EPA, with county supervisors. They dismissed him. He was an unemployed, eccentric old man with a grudge. Pioneer was a powerful corporation, promising jobs and tax revenue. Their lawyers drowned his evidence in a sea of doubt and procedural objections. So he changed tactics. He stopped trying to convince the authorities. He focused on building an undeniable, ironclad case, a mountain of evidence so large it couldn't be ignored or buried. A case that someone else would have to take up after he was gone. And that someone was me. I felt a strange mix of terror and pride. He had entrusted me with his life's work. He had believed that the kid he'd never known would have the strength and integrity to see it through. He hadn't just been protecting me from Pioneer by staying away. He had been preparing me for this fight. All those years in the system, feeling like I had no one and nothing, I had been wrong. I had a legacy. I had a purpose. It had just been waiting for me, buried under a floor in a rusty metal hut. The hut itself was part of his plan. As I read, I began to understand its design. The Quonset wasn't just a shelter. It was camouflage. From the air, or from a distance, it looked like an abandoned prospector's shack. Nothing to see here. But the way it was built into the cave gave him a secure, hidden laboratory, invisible to prying eyes and stable in temperature for his samples. The hand-crank generator wasn't just for light. It powered his sensitive testing equipment. Everything had a purpose. As the full weight of the discovery settled on me, I felt a profound connection to this man I barely remembered. I understood his silence, his distance. It wasn't abandonment, it was strategy. It was love, expressed in the only way he knew how, by building a fortress to protect a truth that could one day set me, and many others, free. I was no longer just Leo, the orphan from Northgate. I was Thomas Astor's grandson, and this was my war now. The question was, what was my first move? I couldn't just walk into a police station with a box of files. They'd dismiss me just as they'd dismissed him. I was a 17-year-old runaway living in a shack. Pioneer's lawyers would tear me apart. I needed an ally. I needed someone who understood the system, someone who could navigate the world that had crushed my grandfather. My mind went back to the sterile office on the 32nd floor. Mr. Abernathy, the man who had told me to take the money and run. He had called my grandfather eccentric. He had called this land worthless. But he had also been my grandfather's lawyer, and his final instruction had been to inform me of my inheritance. He had fulfilled his legal duty even when he disagreed with it. He was a man of rules, of procedures, and what I had was a mountain of procedural evidence. It was a long shot. He would probably hang up on me, but he was the only link I had to that world. I packed one of the archival boxes with the most damning evidence, the summary journals, a dozen of the most recent lab reports, and the map of the contamination plume. The walk back to Silver Creek felt different this time. I wasn't running away. I was counterattacking. The 8 miles didn't feel as long. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I walked into the same general store I had arrived at weeks ago. The old man was behind the counter. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Figured the mountain had swallowed you whole." "Not yet," I said. "I need to use your phone." The call to Abernathy was as difficult as I'd imagined. The old store owner let me use the phone on his counter, a heavy black rotary model that felt as ancient as my grandfather's key. I gave the operator Abernathy's number from the Pioneer letter and waited, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. His secretary put me on hold for what felt like an eternity. I could picture him in his high-rise office, annoyed at the interruption. "Abernathy, He finally barked into the phone. "Mr. Abernathy, it's Leo."
Leo Astor.
There was a long pause. "Leo," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Have you come to your senses? I hope you're calling to accept the offer. The 90-day clock is ticking." "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not calling about the offer. I'm calling about why Pioneer is so desperate to buy the land. I'm calling about hexavalent chromium." Silence. For the first time, the unflappable lawyer was quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the phone line, a universe of distance between my dusty outpost and his polished world. "What did you just say?" he asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautious. "I said I know why my grandfather refused to sell. I found his research. 20 years of water sample analysis, lab reports, journals. He's been documenting illegal dumping by Pioneer Development for 2 decades. The land isn't worthless, Mr. Abernathy. It's the only piece of evidence they can't buy or bury." I let the words hang there. I had his attention. "Where are you?" he asked. "Silver Creek. I have a box of the primary evidence with me." "Stay there," he said, his voice now sharp, commanding. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't move. I'll be there tomorrow." He hung up. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, the dial tone buzzing. I had done it. I had thrown the stone. Now I had to wait and see where the ripples went. The store owner, whose name I learned was Hank, had been pretending to stock shelves nearby, listening to my half of the conversation. He looked at me with a new respect. "Old man Astor, huh?" he said, shaking his head slowly. "Folks around here thought he was just a crazy old coot, always taking water from the creek, muttering about toxins." "He wasn't crazy," I said. Hank nodded. "Seems that way. You need a place to wait? You can't stay out on the street." He offered me the back room of the store, a small, cluttered space with a cot. The gesture, the simple offer of safety, almost brought me to tears. For the first time, I wasn't entirely alone in this. The next day was the longest of my life. I waited, pacing the small room, the box of evidence at my feet like a loyal dog. Every car that drove through town made my heart leap. Finally, late in the afternoon, a sleek black sedan, utterly out of place in the rustic town, pulled up in front of the store. Mr. Abernathy got out. He looked even more angular and out of place here than he did in his office, his expensive suit and leather shoes an affront to the dusty street. He saw me standing in the doorway and strode toward me, his face a mask of grim professionalism. He didn't greet me. He just pointed at the box. "Is that it?" I nodded. "Let's go," he said, turning back toward his car. We drove in silence for a few miles, heading back toward the city. Then he pulled over at a scenic overlook, killed the engine, and turned to face me. "Show me," he said. I opened the box and handed him the first file. He began to read. He read with a lawyer's speed and precision, his eyes scanning, absorbing. He moved from the lab reports to the journal entries, his expression growing more and more serious. The sun began to set, filling the car with orange light. He didn't seem to notice. He just kept reading, page after page. When he finally looked up, the sky was dark. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a dismissive suit. I saw a man who understood the weight of what was in this box. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "He was a remarkable man, and a damn fool for not hiring a better lawyer." He shook his head. "He came to me once, years ago, with some of this. I told him he didn't have enough, that they would crush him. I told him to give up." He looked out at the darkening mountains. I was wrong. He turned back to me, his gaze intense. "This changes everything, Leo. This isn't about a nuisance property anymore. This is a federal case, a massive one. Pioneer won't just be fighting for your 5 acres now. They'll be fighting to exist." The consequences of what I had started finally hit me. This was real. The giant I had provoked was now turning its head to look at me. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Abernathy took a deep breath, his professional demeanor snapping back into place, but changed, charged with a new energy. "First, you are no longer a runaway. You are my client. You'll stay with me. Your grandfather's complete archives need to be secured and moved to a safe location immediately. Second, we do not go to the EPA. We do not go to the press. Not yet. They are a wounded animal, and they are dangerous. We go to them directly. We have something they want, the complete, unpublished evidence of their criminal negligence. And they have something we want, a future for you, and justice for this valley." He started the car. The engine purred, a sound of power and purpose. We were no longer running from a problem. We were driving toward a solution. The quiet victory he had spoken of was within reach, but I knew it wouldn't be a simple negotiation. It would be a battle, fought not with hammers and spades, but with paper and ink, in rooms I couldn't even imagine. My grandfather had built the weapon. Abernathy would teach me how to wield it. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom battle. It was a quiet, brutal war of attrition, fought through letters, conference calls, and tense meetings in sterile boardrooms. Abernathy was a master of this terrain. He protected me, keeping me away from the front lines, while he used my grandfather's evidence like a surgeon's scalpel. He filed a preliminary injunction citing environmental concerns, which immediately halted Pioneer's ability to do any work on their property. It was a small move, but it was the first shot across their bow. Their response was swift. Their lawyers descended, a flock of crows in expensive suits, trying to intimidate and bury us in paperwork. They filed motions to dismiss. They questioned the chain of custody of the samples. They launched a private investigation into my life, trying to paint me as an unstable, delinquent teenager looking for a payday. They tried to paint my grandfather as a vindictive crank, but they couldn't argue with the science. Abernathy had sent the key samples to a new set of labs, confirming my grandfather's findings. The evidence was irrefutable. The contamination was real. The turning point came in a meeting I wasn't supposed to be at. Abernathy had advised against it, but I insisted. I needed to see them, the men who had ruined my grandfather and were poisoning a valley. The meeting was in Abernathy's office. 3 lawyers from Pioneer sat across the table, their faces smug and confident. They made their final offer. They would pay the back taxes, give me $100,000, and in return, I would turn over all of my grandfather's research and sign a non-disclosure agreement that would bury the truth forever. "It's a generous offer, Leo," the lead lawyer said, smiling at me like a shark. "It will set you up for life. You can go to college, buy a car. Forget all this unpleasantness." I looked at his smiling face, and I saw the same dismissal, the same arrogance that had killed my grandfather's spirit. But it didn't work on me. I had lived in his hut. I had read his words. I felt his legacy living inside me. I leaned forward. "No," I said. The smile on the lawyer's face faltered. "I'm sorry?" "The answer is no. There is no amount of money that will convince me to let you keep poisoning people. This isn't about me getting set up for life. This is about you taking responsibility for what you've done." I pushed a single photograph across the table. It was the picture of my mom and grandfather. The man you destroyed was my family. The land you want was his life's work. It's not for sale." Abernathy took it from there. He laid out our terms. Pioneer would fund the creation of a trust, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to the complete cleanup of the aquifer and the surrounding land, overseen by an independent board. They would establish a lifetime health monitoring program for the residents of the valley. And they would issue a public apology acknowledging the work of Thomas Astor. In return, we would not release the evidence to the press or pursue criminal charges. It was checkmate. They could fight us in court, and the discovery process would make all the evidence public, destroying their company and landing their executives in jail. Or they could take the deal, contain the damage, and survive. They chose to survive. The papers were signed a week later. There were no headlines, no victory parade. It was a quiet surrender. The back taxes on my property were paid by an anonymous wire transfer. The lien was lifted. The land was mine, free and clear. A few weeks later, a check for $100,000 arrived at Abernathy's office. It wasn't from Pioneer. It was from a legal settlement fund, a carefully laundered payment to keep their name off it. It was the generous offer they had made, a final, cynical attempt to frame this as a transaction. I signed the check over to the new cleanup trust the next day. Abernathy looked at me, a rare, small smile on his face. "Your grandfather would be proud, Leo." I knew he was right. I returned to Silver Creek not as a runaway, but as a landowner. Hank from the general store spread the word about what had happened in his own quiet way. The story of the crazy old coot and his city grandson who had taken on the big corporation became a local legend. People looked at me differently. They would nod as I walked down the street. They saw me not as an outsider, but as one of them, as the guardian of their water. I moved back into the Quonset hut. It was no longer a cold, scary place. It was my home. I used some money I had earned working for Abernathy as a clerk to buy new supplies. I repaired the roof, properly this time. I installed a new, efficient wood stove. I ran a small solar panel to power lights and a small refrigerator. I cleaned and organized my grandfather's workshop, his tools fitting into my hand like they were made for me. I didn't just fix the hut. I started to build a life. I spent my days exploring the land, walking the same paths my grandfather had walked. I learned the names of the trees, the calls of the birds. I took my own water samples, using his equipment, continuing his work of monitoring the health of the land. The cave, once a place of fear, became a place of peace, a cool, silent retreat in the heat of the summer. What I had built inside that cave wasn't just a case against a corporation. It was a connection to my past. It was a foundation for my future. It saved me, not by giving me money, but by giving me a purpose. It taught me that a home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's a place to stand your ground. It's a story to belong to. It's a fight worth fighting. Looking back, it's strange to think how it all started. A kid with a cardboard box, standing on a sidewalk, feeling like the world had ended. But it wasn't an ending. It was a threshold. So often, the moments that feel like the end are actually the beginning of the story that will define us. My inheritance wasn't 5 acres of rock and a rusty hut. It was a choice. The choice to run from a difficult truth or to stand and face it. The choice to take the easy money or to fight for something that money can't buy. We all face choices like that, in big ways and small. Have you ever been handed a situation that seemed impossible? A legacy that felt more like a burden than a gift? Maybe it wasn't a piece of land, but a family secret, a difficult promise, or a challenge that everyone told you to walk away from. What did you do? The world will always offer you the easy way out, the clean break, the settlement. It will tell you to be practical, to take the money and run. But sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that can't be bought. A sense of purpose, a connection to your past, the knowledge that you stood for something when it would have been easier to stand for nothing. My grandfather's hut is my home now. It's solid, warm, and safe. The community of Silver Creek has become my community. They look out for me, and I look out for their water. The work my grandfather started continues. The trust is slowly, painstakingly cleaning the aquifer. It will take decades, but it has begun. And it began because one man refused to be silenced, and because a lost kid decided to listen. This journey taught me that home isn't something you're given. It's something you build. Sometimes you have to build it out of rusty metal and broken pieces. Sometimes you have to build it in the dark, with nothing but a flicker of hope and a promise from a ghost. But if you keep working, if you keep fighting, you can build something that will not only shelter you, but save you. You can build a place where you belong. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for your own piece of ground, I hope you'll join our community here. Subscribe to the channel, and more importantly, share your story in the comments below. I read every one of them. Because every story of survival, every story of finding home in an unexpected place, is a light in the dark. Thank you for listening. You are not alone in this.